Let's get right down to it, because as I said before, there's a lot of ground to cover tonight. We're doing, once again, Progress Without Peace, 8th lecture, colder climate, Israel in the first Eisenhower administration, 1952 to 56. Eisenhower, of course, had two terms. So let me start off with the background. Israel had big mazel, as we all know, in its first years, because the first years of Israel was supposed to be the fourth term of Roosevelt. Can you hear me? Okay, right. 1945, 6, 7, 8. It was supposed to be the fourth term of Franklin Roosevelt. He was elected to office in 44, and that wouldn't have been so great. 1 month before Roosevelt died, he meets with King Saud, Ibn Saud, on the way back from the Alta Conference, and famously he said, I learned more about what's really going on in Palestine for 5 minutes talking to Ibn Saud than I learned from talking to Stephen Wise and all the other guys for years, which did not bode well for the state of Israel. In other words, what I'm trying to say is you don't realize how history was changed by the fact that he dropped dead a month after this meeting, because otherwise all the years of 45, 46, 47, 48, which we always associate with, the rise of the state of Israel and all the rest of it, probably wouldn't happen. Instead, through destiny, in other words, through Hashgacha, you got Truman with Eddie Jacobson over here. I want to run this again. It just so happened, in other words, that those years, 46, 47, this is the first movie Truman put out about himself right after he came into office. Here, take a look at it, take a minute.
Shortly after being discharged from the Army, Harry Truman and a soldier friend established this clothing store in Kansas City. But along came the National Depression, which caused the business to fail. And it is to the everlasting credit of Harry S. Truman that he slaved for 15 years to pay.
That's Eddie Jacobson, of course. So the fact that he wanted to advertise that shows you how close they were, and we all have seen in the past with the talks I've given, Israel very lucky that sort of quirk existed in the years 45, 40, 47, 48, and down into 1952 until Truman left office. Despite some issues, and we've certainly gone into that great detail, unfortunately Truman stopped the Israeli army before they could take over all of Israel and all that sort of thing. That's true. Fundamentally, Truman was biased in favor of Israel. I mean, really biased in favor of Israel. I have here one of the latest biography of Atchison, who was Truman's Secretary of State, who I spoke about in the past. And there's a wonderful story here at the end where he's talking about 1952, and he's talking about foreign aid, and Atchison wants an impartial foreign policy, even-handed foreign policy, but Truman has his own definition. Over time, Truman's definition of balance in the ratio of Israel to Arab assistance wore Atchison down. An aide, Leroy Steinbauer, recalled the time when the White House returned a draft aid budget with just one mark on it, an HST comment, a Truman comment, that state had not followed his rule of Middle East impartiality. A puzzled Steinbauer took it to Atchison. I don't understand this. What can he mean? Atchison replied, don't you understand? Take the total aid that you've gone to give to the whole Middle East, divide it 50%, give 50% to Israel, and divide the rest up among all the Arabs. That's what they call impartial at the White House. So Israel was Hashgacha processes were very lucky that the first very weak years, first very formative years, when things were really touch and go, and it was a tzena, and they were barely making, and all the rest of it, they had this kind of unusual situation in the White House. The Arabs, during the years of 48 to 52, justifiably were tremendously frustrated with Truman. So were the State Department types, as you see over here in what I just described. They thought that the White House, Truman is off the wall and not cognizant of American needs and all the rest of it, all of which was absolutely true. All of which was true. Now, then comes 52. By the time you get to Truman's second term, the Democrats have been in for 20 years straight. Do you understand that? Roosevelt won 4 times in a row, and then Truman won 1 time. That's 5 presidential elections in a row. That's the longest in American history. The Republicans were desperate. They were crazy. The atmosphere was tremendously poisoned because you didn't have a 2-party system anymore. It's just one keeps winning, and so the other party got really twisted out of shape over this, and that's why they pounded very hard, very successfully too, in American politics, that the Democrats are soft on communism. That was the best way they figured they could get him out of office, and this is, of course, the famous era of Joe McCarthy, and Richard Nixon was a friend of his, and Taft, and all the rest of it. And by the way, there was truth to this. By that I mean Truman was not soft on communism, but there were, to be perfectly honest, there were all these communists and sympathizers in the government. People don't like to admit it, but there is truth to it. And the way the foreign policy went looked like it was going in the wrong direction. And anyway, all of this leads to the rise of Eisenhower, okay, who will then become, as you know, the triumphant president in 52. Eisenhower started out obviously as a soldier. He wasn't Stamm's soldier. Eisenhower was the commander-in-chief in World War II on the European front. He's the one that led all the armies against the Germans. And yes, he made mistakes. The military historians can tell you all about it. You know, they should have done this. I know plenty of them. Doesn't matter. At the end of the day, he won. That's how people think. You don't micromanage, but he did it, okay? Which is tremendous. Look at the war machine Hitler had. You understand? And he did it. So this gave him an unbelievable prestige among the American people. Not only was he a successful general, but Eisenhower was also seen as a quintessential American. In other words, he was a general of the right type, okay? And what you see over here, for example, is that he did, as far as the Jews are concerned, as far as the World War II is concerned, he made his business to go with the cameras to the concentration camp when the Allies liberated him to see all the horrors. So as he said, nobody should say it didn't happen. And number two, he wants to say like this. He says, and I consider this to be chashuv, I consider this to be important, and not something that you sweep under the rug, which I guarantee you the Germans and most of the Europeans would rather do. Take a look at this for a second.
Those others were damning pictures indeed, yet not to be compared with the dreadful spectacle which greeted General Eisenhower when the Supreme Commander visited the Nazi concentration.
There's Eisenhower and Ohrdruf. There's Eisenhower. And they're showing him how they tortured the prisoners. So notice he was sending a message, and that is we not only fought the war for America, of course, obviously, to defeat the American enemy, but the enemy of mankind. Knows what they did to the Jews and to people like that was unconscionable. And so Eisenhower, therefore, not only is the image of the great general, but also of the great liberator, okay, the liberator. His famous book was Crusade for Freedom. And finally, the Eisenhower, the anti-Nazi, which is always an image he gave, which wasn't true of all the generals. I'm going to show you something in a second, but I want to point out before you see it. When the Germans surrendered finally in May of 1945, they had to go to Eisenhower's headquarters at Reims, or Rams, in France. And as generals, Keitel and Jodl, all the big shots from the Nazis, from the German army. And they go to his headquarters for the surrender ceremony. He's not there. He has his number 2 guy, General Walter Beadle-Smith, the chief of staff, sign the papers with the Nazis. He's in the next room. You see? I don't want to talk to these people. When it's over, you'll see. When it's over, the German generals, after they signed everything, are brought into Eisenhower's room, and he says like this. He says, do you understand that what's written over here? If you don't keep everything that you just signed on, you're going to be in big trouble. Yes, we understand. But that's it. Now get out of here. And the German general said like this. He said, I want to shake hands with you. He said, I don't want to shake hands with you. Eisenhower said this. Not on the cameras. He said, I don't want to shake hands with you because I don't consider you soldiers. Soldier fight against other soldier. Well, you do a bunch of animals. You see? Now, I happen to know this. I'll tell you why. I once had a teacher long ago in Hopkins who was a black guy. It was unusual. He was an officer in the intelligence corps in World War II, and he happened to be there. And he told us in the class that he saw the whole thing. And it wasn't done for PR, right? But it was done, that's what he felt. And this sends a message. You understand? So take a look. If you see Eisenhower in the picture signing it until after the Germans are gone, then he walks out and holds up the pen. Take a look. Dear Smith.
Eisenhower, the cameras record the scene as terms are laid down, with the Supreme Commander represented by General Walter B. Smith. With the Americans, all the Allies sat in to enforce the terms we set long ago. Surrender with no soft terms. It seems hard for the Nazi Euro, and it was, to admit his country's guilt and plead for mercy. But General Smith's signature is a symbol of a new world of peace. A Bill of Rights for Europe. Nothing could be more symbolic of the downfall of the Third Reich than this abject surrender. Let us not forget Germany, but meanwhile let us fight to quick victory over Japan. With the German troops set on their way.
Now Eisenhower showed up after they left.
Signatures, the Allied delegates visit General Eisenhower's private headquarters. It's a happy day for the victors. Victory with the pens of peace.
You understood what I just said. Now you saw he wasn't there. And people knew this, and it's sending a message. It is not as simple as you want, because some of the other generals, like this guy, were Nazi lovers. Patton was anti-Semite. Oh, yeah. And not only that, it's one of the great ironies of history, that this guy, who was actually very sympathetic to the whole Nazi business, ended up killing all the Nazis. You see? The Rebbeinu Shalom has a funny way of running the world, as they say. You know, shista bezim, if David Shavil says, if a guy wants a broom, can shoot. And so he took a person like Patton, who really belonged in the German army, and made him born in America, in Virginia, and in the American army, and he's the one who destroyed the Nazi army, you understand? So I guess it takes one to beat one. The bottom line is that Eisenhower was not like that, okay? And yet, it's not so pashut. What about Eisenhower and the Jews? It's a little more complex, because Eisenhower was a West Point graduate. He was, let's get this straight, he's from a poor farm boy, so to speak, who had a high IQ and very poor background, like many Americans. And he ended up going as a young boy, young man, to West Point because it's a free education. I'm talking about really poor in Abilene, Kansas. And he went in the regular route of the military profession. And the officer corps of the United States Army, especially in the old days, not like today, very prejudiced. That's who they are. You understand? They don't blacks, they don't like Jews, they don't like this, that, and the other. It's natural that it's going to be like that. And Eisenhower, for example, when he was coming up to the thing, his hero, his main guy, was General Van Horn Moseley, George Van Moseley, who was number 2 to MacArthur. He was deputy chief of staff, one of the big machers, and a very brilliant officer in the Corps. Had a great deal of hashpah, you might say, on all the other officers, and a tremendous anti-Semite. He made Patton look like a Jew lover. You understand? If you don't believe me, go look at the next picture over here. What does it say? It's war now proposed for the purpose of establishing Jewish hegemony throughout the world, which is the reason why he did not become the commander-in-chief of the army after MacArthur left in 1935, because Roosevelt was the president, and Roosevelt said no, you see? Whereupon Moseley became like a pro-Nazi type and all the rest of it. And to be honest, all the generals liked him. I'm just trying to show you it's a very complex kind of relationship, and it's, again, a little bit ironic that Eisenhower would be the liberator of the concentration camps, but history is full of irony. On the other hand, Eisenhower served in Washington, D.C., if you know his career, for about 10 years or 8 years. Under MacArthur, he was a captain. That's the young Eisenhower, there's MacArthur. When the bonus march, remember they shot the bonus marchers and all, they burned it down in 1932 under Hoover. And the point is that means that Eisenhower learned politics. If he was in Washington, D.C. at the War Department, that means you have to testify in front of Congress, you have to be in charge of the media and the press, and as such, being in Washington, D.C. during the 1930s, he came to see that there are Jews in America too, and not only that, in the Roosevelt administration, many Jews have high and big and chashuv positions. For example, let's take a look at the next one. I mean, you have Frankfurter, you have Bernard Baruch. These are the 2 guys that made Marshall the chief of staff. I don't know if you know your history or not. People don't. There were many generals in line to take over after the guy before Marshall was there. Nobody even heard of him, General Craig. And there's a reason no one heard of him. But the point is that, you know, who do you appoint number 1? That's a very political kind of decision for commander-in-chief, for President of the United States. And Bernard Baruch especially knew the army stuff very well. He remembered Marshall from First World War, and he said, we might have a war now. There it might be. You need somebody that's really good. And they jumped him over like 150 officers to make him in charge. Eisenhower knows this. You understand? Marshall knows this, and the others do. So it's a Jewish influence. In this case, it was a good thing, but I'm just telling you that you don't go over, if you want to be like Van Horn Mosley, you're not going to have a career. So keep that in mind. In 1935, MacArthur, when he left when he retired from being the chief of staff of the United States Army, went to the Philippines to take over there to be in charge of the army, and he schlepped Eisenhower with him, who was there as Eisenhower. They're all in the white uniforms. There's MacArthur, wherever he is, there's Eisenhower. They're supposed to set up the Philippine army, and therefore Eisenhower was in an interesting place in the late 30s, just before the war, because he was approached. He writes in his memoirs, he was approached by a bunch of Jews in the Philippines to try to organize a system in which you can bring German Jews to settle in the Philippines. Because remember, in the late 30s, where the Jews going to go from Germany, from Austria? There's nowhere to go. Some say to Tijuana, as we saw, and some say to Africa. One of the ideas was the Philippines, which could have happened, and that means Eisenhower is sensitized at least to the fact there's a German-Jewish a Jewish refugee situation, all the rest of it. This does not make him a Jew lover at all, but it makes him much more aware of what's going on in the world than the average officer in the United States Army, was totally devoted, like Patton, just to mastering the weapons and all that sort of thing. In World War II, Eisenhower, like Marshall, was jumped over like 150 generals to be put in charge. All these guys had interesting careers. When the World War II started, Eisenhower was still like a major or lieutenant colonel. He was on nothing. But then Marshall brought him to Washington, and then they promote him. Next thing you know, he's the commander-in-chief in Europe, in charge of the invasion of North Africa. And when he, in 1942, does lead the invasion in North Africa, it was a very complex business, and the Jews were involved because what the Allies did, the Americans under Eisenhower and the British, British under Eisenhower, what they did was they invaded Morocco and Algeria, where there's a lot of Jews, and Eisenhower did an interesting shtick, which is that they secretly contacted the Vichy French commander-in-chief in North Africa. That's the guy that's supposed to be pro-Hitler. His name was Admiral Darlan, you see, right? He was like number 2 or number 3 to Marshal Pétain. And he basically said like this: if you will not oppose the invasion it won't be an invasion. If you won't oppose the Americans, the British coming in and taking over, we'll keep you in power. You'll continue to rule the French North Africa, and we won't interfere. We just want to do something against the Germans, who are really, should be your enemies too. And Eisenhower did cut this deal, and they signed it. But what that means is that when the Americans land on November, I think, of 42, and they do pretty quickly take over Morocco and Algeria. This is before they went on to Tunisia to fight Rommel. Took a long time. But Morocco and Algeria, they took over right away. So that what they say is like this: we're just here to fight the Germans. You French, under Admiral Darlan, you continue running the things the way you do. We do not want to interfere in your internal affairs. Well, guess what? The Vichy French, under Darlan, have a lot of things going, and one of them is they have concentration camps for the Jews and things like that, because they were pro-Hitler, and in terms of their racial sympathies, they are definitely pro-Nazi. And so here you have the American army in a place, and the Jews are being persecuted, and all hell broke loose in the American press in December of 43 and January and whatever of December 42 and January and February of 43. It was called the Darlan deal. Oh my goodness, you go back to the New York Times or the New Republic or any of the newspapers from back then, and oh, we're in bed with the Germans, we're just as bad as they are. Eisenhower's a German. See, I told you, he's working for Hitler and all the rest of it, which wasn't true. And eventually they worked it out. Darlan was assassinated by some Frenchmen, and it went away. Say, oh, Morgenthau went over the whole big business. Could talk just about the whole Darlan episode. But it kind of worked out in the end. But Eisenhower he had an experience of being burned by the anti-Semitism issue, okay? Which is why he's always very sensitive to it. And that's why a number of months later in the Sicily campaign, when General Patton beat up a Jewish soldier, because you all know that story, he slapped yes you do. He says Patton walked into it's one of the famous stories about, I'm surprised at you. He says right? Patton was a real tough guy, and he came into the tent, and he saw a guy there who was shell-shocked or something like this. And he said, you're not even wounded, get back in the front. And the guy said, I feel bad or something like that. And he beat him up with a pistol. You pistol whipped him and so forth, which a general can do, but the guy was Jewish. They never talked about it. You understand? And Eisenhower said, that's all we need. So he fired Patton, and they made him apologize publicly to the soldier. And he said, this is not the German army. You understand? There's rules and regulations. If somebody does something, you follow the rules and regulations. You don't go beat somebody up. It's not the Russian army. So I'm just telling you that he was aware of the sensitivities associated with these kinds of issues. He's not the regular soldier. When the war was over, Eisenhower spent a certain amount of time with the DPs, whether he wanted to or not. He made it his business to visit them on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur with all the news there, sending a message to the Germans and the Americans: we are not the Nazis. We don't approve of all this sort of thing. And the Jews, especially the displaced persons, are deserving of a basic human respect. It's a very complicated story. I'm not doing justice to it, but now's not the time to go into that. This is, by the way, if you ever look in the Kloisenberger Rebbe books, you will see photographs, because he went on Yom Kippur with all the media over there, and to I think Fernwald or Feldafing, which were the DP camps, and the Kloisenberger Rebbe was there with his talis and all the rest. They gave him a bracha. So anyway, he had a lot of experience in this area. Let me say that later on, when he comes the president with a lot more experience and wisdom out there than Truman had when he became president, because Truman was a nobody, as we all know. He didn't know anything. He was the first one who said it, and it wasn't fair that Roosevelt didn't fill him in, but that's the fact. And Eisenhower, on the other hand, had huge experience negotiating with governments, commanding millions of soldiers, leading men into battle, handling international alliances, dealing with Stalin. He came in unusually qualified, I would say, for the office of the presidency. Keep that in mind. On the other hand, Eisenhower had no sympathy with Zionism. Why should he? Right? Truman was a Mishigas. Why should he be in favor of Zionism? It's not in favor of America's position in the Middle East. Wouldn't life be better if there was no Israel, if there were no Jews over there? It'd just be the Arabs, it'd be the oil, they don't like Russia, we don't like Russia, it'd be no problems. You could totally understand it. He was the chief of staff of the United States Army after the Second World War was over, in 45 and 46 and 47. He's looking at it from the American military point of view. Why shouldn't he? He's not Jewish. He's not a best friend who's Jewish or anything like that to cloud his judgment. From looking at it from a straightforward, totally, strictly white Anglo-Saxon Protestant American perspective, why should it be Israel? The Zionists went to him in 1946 with chief of staff of the army. He said, I got no time for this. If you guys weren't here, life would be a lot easier for America, which you can't deny. On the other hand, as you just see, he was not unaware of Hitler and the concentration camps and all the rest of it. And so, like all these people in America, after Truman made the terrible mistake of recognizing Israel as it became a reality, the whole thing was a mistake. But what do we do now? We can't let them get killed by the Arabs. You see, this is the fundamental attitude that someone like Eisenhower brings to the table. But I do want to emphasize over here that Eisenhower was very different than Truman in this regard. Truman really had to learn on the job, and to be perfectly honest, some he did and some he did not. The very fact that he went against the whole State Department to recognize Israel shows that he wasn't totally up to speed the way they thought he should be. In other words, Eisenhower was brought to office a much richer and broader set of experiences, right, in running the presidency, which is why he won in a landslide in 1952. Okay? Very interesting. Eisenhower, well, I'm going to talk about this tonight. It's a very important point. Eisenhower was a very smart guy, very smart. He wouldn't get to where he wasn't smart. And he had a way of operating as president, even before that, in which what you do in public is not what's happening behind the scenes. And he liked to get things done and settled behind the scenes. It's not necessary for the public to know all the junk that goes along there. And his preference as president will be to try to work. Nixon was like that also. Maybe, secret diplomacy, secret actions. Even, for example, when McCarthy problem, what he did with Senator McCarthy, he said, I don't want to deal with him up front because that'll be me against him. If we krieg the Ryan in the back and we get him, let him hoist himself his own petard, the expression goes, then we'll get rid of McCarthy that way, which did work. So people in the public would always say, what's he doing, what's he doing, what's he doing? Later on, the historians all find that, he was working all the time behind the scenes. It's very interesting. Now, he's half the equation. The other half is that when he becomes president, he appoints as the Secretary of State the famous John Foster Dulles. John Foster Dulles is one of the most famous secretaries of state. And interesting, I'll tell you something most people don't know. He's one of the most beloved secretaries of state. He had tremendous poll ratings all the way through. despite mistakes that he make, they all make mistakes. There's no such thing as secretaries say don't make mistakes. And yet, people saw him as the personification of American anti-communism, of Christian American anti-communism, if you wish, and a clear-headed unwillingness, unlike Truman they saw, to be fooled by the communists. I'm not saying that was an accurate way of seeing, but that's how he was seen. And you'll see his whole style is one in which very Cold War, in which he said, oh, we're losing ground to the Russians. We're losing ground every year. This interview, you'll see, it'll take a minute, was by a TV show when Truman was still president, 1952. And Dulles was at the peak of his reputation because he had just negotiated for Truman a very successful peace treaty with Japan, which kicked the Russians out, right? You know, it's without going into details. And so he was at the height of his fame, and he's a distinguished New York lawyer, Sullivan and Cromwell. I'm sure everybody's heard of that. Many have. And I mean, he was the head of Sullivan Cromwell. And oh my goodness, he is very aware of the communist threat. Take a look at this.
Now, sir, in your opinion, are we stronger
This is the reporter.
against Russia than we were last year?
I think
That's Dulles.
it's pretty hard to judge those things, but my estimate would be that the tide is still running against us. Everywhere I look around the world, the question is, what maybe we're going to lose next, you know, and we seem to be on the defensive and that they're on the offensive.
The question is, what are we going to lose each year more than what are we going to gain?
You can look around the whole circle of the world, and you find one spot after another, after another, after another, where the question is, are we going to lose the free world? Is it going to be Iran, or is it going to be Egypt, or is it going to be Indochina, or is it going to be Korea, or what's it going to be?
Now,
Okay, so you get the idea. And I'll tell you something. Under Truman, look, they lost China. You know, they lost that. That's the impression it kind of gave over there. Dulles with the Jews is a very interesting parsha. It almost deserves a lecture by itself, which I don't have time for. Suffice it to say that John Dulles, a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, he was the lawyer for the German government under Hitler. You understand? In other words, you know, by that I mean they ran its business. You know, he was a Wall Street lawyer, and the German government did business in the United States of America. And in the 1930s, you know, Sullivan Cromwell had that account, and he was isolationist, for example, because he didn't trust Russia. It's a very, you know, all that sort of America first. And yet, I wouldn't say it's not so simple to say that he doesn't like Jews, anti-Semitic. I mean, nobody likes Jews. You understand? You know, not when you're in the top of the Wall Street firm, but the white shoe law, Wall Street, but you know, history is strange. And Dulles had a sister. Okay? She wasn't the prettiest girl in the world, but she was one of the most brilliant. And she, Eleanor Dulles, well, hear me out. She's Eleanor Dulles, and she had a PhD from Radcliffe. You know, she went to Bryn Mawr, Radcliffe, all that stuff. You know, all the top of the line. She was a brilliant economist. She helped set up the World Bank and the IMF and all this kind of take it from me. She was married to Orthodox Jew from Shereth Israel, downtown on McCullough Street. Yeah, David Blondheim. I promise you. He was from family, and he was married, then got divorced. You know, that was a very unsuccessful marriage. And he was a professor at Johns Hopkins University. You know how hard it was for a Jew to be a professor at that time, Johns Hopkins University, except he was a graduate from Hopkins and a Baltimore native, so that helped him. But still was hard. He was the world's leader in Old French. You want to laugh at what I'm saying. He wrote the book, or the books, on Old Rashi. You know, Rashi with the laws. You all know what I'm talking about, right? Rashi uses the old French words. What do they mean? And the French government gave him the Legion of Honor and all these kind of business. He had a very high position. And in Zivik Cheney, you know, in 1930, he married John Foster Dulles' sister. Okay? So you can imagine both families horrified, right? Equally, what all the in-laws agreed that this is a bad shidduch. Okay? They coming from the WASP perspective, his family coming from Shereth Israel perspective, and so forth it was. And they had 2 children, and then he committed suicide by sticking his head in an oven and turning on the gas. You understand? Which is, you know, I couldn't make this up. You understand? And so they always write, you know, he died in 1934 or whatever. And it's a crazy. So let's put it this way: the nephews of John Foster Dulles are named Blondheim, right? Except they changed the name to Dulles. Well, you get farther ahead in life if you change your name to Dulles. The point is that it ain't so simple. You see what I'm saying? Moreover, so I don't know, because I'm not a psychologist, had this played with his mind, John Foster Dulles. I do know this, that in the late 40s, when the senator from New York died, so the governor of New York at that time, Dewey, appointed Dulles to be senator of New York. But then you have to have an election. And when they have the election, so it's him against Herbert Lehman, the famous Reform Jew, was the governor 10 times in New York. Herbert Lehman, Mr. Liberal Jew. I mean, he was the quintessential person. He ran the UNRWA, and he was in the New Deal and all this. He was Franklin Roosevelt's lieutenant governor. You understand? And Dulles' campaign was run by his brother, Allen Dulles, who later ran the CIA. And they tried to do like this. Lehman is a Jew. Jew is a communist. So, he's a red or a pinko and all the rest of it. Lehman was no fool. He said, I guess, I'm a communist, you're a Nazi. You were a lawyer for Hitler, right? That lost, let's put it this way, that lost in Brooklyn, and the Bronx, right? And some other things like that. And Dulles was crushed. So he learned a few lessons along the way about, it's not so politic to mess with the Jews either. So he's coming into Secretary of State with a whole bunch of very interesting set of experiences, just like Eisenhower was. Dulles had been waiting for years. Let's go to the next one. Wilkie promised him in 1940 he would be Secretary of State, but he lost. Dewey promised him he'd be Secretary of State in 1944 and 1948, but he lost. So it's like always the bridesmaid, never the bride. He can't. So by the time Eisenhower wins in 1952, yes, I finally got the prize. The new administration, Eisenhower's administration, no Jews. Okay? I mean, as the Republicans, it's coming in there. It's all pretty much white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. That's who the Republican Party generally was, with one big exception, and that was Admiral Lewis Strauss, who Eisenhower worshipped. Lewis Strauss was a ultra-reformed Jew of the anti-Israel variety. Okay? You know what I'm talking about, the American Council of Judaism, one of the Machers in the American Council of Judaism. However, as we will see before I'm done this series, or maybe in the future sometime, he actually did a very interesting transformation, because how do you continue to be against Israel, all the rest of it, after the Holocaust? It's not so simple. You understand? So your basic classic reform leadings may push you in one direction, but experience in life and the scenes of the concentration camp push you in another direction. It'll be a very, very interesting. But I can tell you, Eisenhower appointed him to be the head of the Atomic Energy Commission. Later on, he wanted to make him Secretary of State after Dulles died. Oh my goodness, he worshipped this guy. So again, it's a funny story. You can't go and figure out. And by the way, Eisenhower said, "What I like about you is you're a religious Jew," by which he meant a reform, by his way of thinking. Meaning, you're against Russia. You're a very patriotic American. I would say, in my personal opinion, to Dwight Eisenhower, a classic reform Jew with the perfect Jew. I'm serious about that, right? You take religion very seriously, but of course you're number one American, that comes first, and everything that goes along with that, not in an anti-Semitic way, but he's not Jewish. What do you expect him to be in favor of the Satmar Hasidim or something? Okay? The new administration that came into office now was out to be even-handed, as I said before. Truman, which is true, was too much, as we just saw, was in favor of Israel, too much as they saw it. Now they got to balance it out. They have to win friends around the world. But on the other hand, the political reality, as we know from the Obama administration, is always very important. What's the story in Congress? Eisenhower came into office with a razor-thin Republican majority. You understand? One senator wasn't sure which way he's going to go, and at the end he decided, I'll vote with the Republicans, Wayne Morse. It was later when he switched to Democrat, if some of us may remember him. He was one of these from the West, so he was independent. So sometimes he decided to caucus with them. So the Republicans were in by one man. You understand? And that means that in such a paper-thin majority, the Democratic minority leader, very powerful, Lyndon Johnson, super pro-Israel. Okay? Say what you want about Johnson. There's a lot to say about Johnson, but he was super pro-Israel. And by the way, the Republican majority leader, just for the record, Senator Nolan from California, was also extremely pro-Israel. So Eisenhower and Dulles didn't have a totally free, thank God, didn't have a totally free area in which to work. There is a very strong Israeli, pro-Israel, shall I say, sympathy in the Senate of the United States and the Congress. And Israel was lucky. This was the golden age of Abba Eban. He was the ambassador at that time under Eisenhower. He was the ambassador to Washington. He was the best ambassador Israel had. It was famous in his time that he's the only ambassador the American people ever heard of. I mean, I ask you a question right now. I know you're all brilliant audiences. What's the name of the British ambassador to the United States? Right? Yeah, I rest my case. So no, why should you know, right? So I'm asking you a question. Why should an American school teacher or mayor in 1955 know who the Israeli ambassador is? But they did. You see? So Iban was very good at what he did. Now Eisenhower, as they say, was a very smart guy. We would say today he's like a businessman, you understand? And by that I mean is, he says like this, okay, we'll back Israel, get made. Don't trumpet it. You get it? Just shut up. Try to cool everything down in the Middle East. Don't broadcast. We're going to back Israel. You understand? Once I said it's not necessary to make a concept business out of this. As a matter of fact, the less we say and the better we get along with the Arabs, the better it is for Israel. You see? He's right, sort of, in that. You can hear that. The Eisenhower administration was very clear. They don't want to lose the Arab sympathy. When Israel crossed red lines, as we say today, the Eisenhower administration suspended aid to Israel. But Israel brought it on themselves. For example, when they wiped out that whole town of Gibeah, they cut off the aid. Then a couple months later, they put it back. When Israel, as we'll see in a minute, started playing hanky-panky with the water and stealing water from the Jordan River, all the rest of it, they cut off aid. Because they're like this, you have to do it within a UN framework or something like that, and you can't just do all these unilateral things. That does not make him an anti-Semite, and that does not make him an anti-Israel. It is cheating, right? Ben Gurion thought he could get away with it, and it is what it is. I mean, I want to be very clear about this. Eisenhower was, I told you before, a very smart person. The biographies, until recently, have always put him like a dummy, because Kennedy and the others all called him, a doofus and so forth, and the press always like Kennedy, and they like his point of view. But it's incorrect. And Eisenhower was I told you, he wouldn't have gotten where he was if he wasn't a very smart guy. And when he looked at the Middle East situation, he said like this, if we try to get a regular peace treaty, come on, the Arab's not going to say yes. Let's do it through the back door. And the back door was water. Would you agree water is important in the Middle East? Okay. And it's desperate for Israel and Jordan and Syria and all the other countries, especially for Israel and Jordan, right? Because the others do have some rivers. Not a lot, but they have some. Israel and Jordan hardly has anything, as we all know. At that time, in 1952, 53, Israel and Jordan are already thinking, how are we going to get the water from the river to us? Because if you have the slightest idea of what geography is about in Israel, you have something called the Kinneret. Then you got the Jordan River, Yarden, it goes down to what? To the Dead Sea. So all the water goes into nothing, into the Dead Sea. Does that make any sense? It gets ruined. So, but if you cut off too much, it kills the river. So how do you do it right? So Eisenhower wanted to focus on the waters of the Jordan and to set up what you would call like a TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, to do like a Jordan Valley Authority, and use science and technology, very American, to come up with a way that'll help the Jews and the Arabs. It'll help both of you guys. Let's take the issue away from politics. This is how he talked. Let's take the issue away from politics, focus strictly on the science, the technology side of it, have the civil engineers talk, and, and the Arab-Israeli conflict can continue to go on, all the rest of it, but really we know, at least the hope was, that cooperation in A will lead to cooperation in B, and cooperation in B will lead to cooperation in C, and the anger will die. It's not a dumb move. Right? It's not dumb at all. It didn't quite work the way he wanted, but he appointed the head of the American Chamber of Commerce, America's #1 businessman, Eric Johnson, you'll see in a second, who had negotiated with Stalin and worked for Roosevelt and all this, is a big Republican, worked in both administrations, a very smart guy. And he said, go to the Middle East, without all the publicity, not secretly, but without the publicity, and talk to all the sides. Say, you want water, you need water, continue fighting, but let's talk about, I don't want to take away from your political stance whatsoever, but can we talk about some civil engineer stuff, okay? And you'll see in a minute, he's a very intelligent guy. Here he is, Eric Johnston, who was a famous name once upon a time. Let's take it.
From the CBS television news staff, Larry Lasser and Charles Collingwood. Our distinguished guest for this evening is Eric Johnston, special emissary of the President to the Near East.
Mr. Johnson, you've done so much work of national importance in the last 10 years under 3 administrations, I guess. I probably covered more of your press conferences than almost anyone else. Now you've just returned from the Middle East, where you were the special emissary of the President. Can you tell us exactly what your mission was there?
this valley blossom such as it has never done before, and probably would allay a great many of the fears and the bitternesses that exist in this whole area.
Well, Mr. Johnston, weren't your negotiations made considerably more difficult by the flare-up of trouble on the Israeli-Jordan frontier at about the time you were there?
It certainly was made extremely difficult. As a matter of fact, the bitternesses and the hatred.
Okay. Anyway, you can, again, if you want, you can chase it down yourselves. But you see, he's a very intelligent guy. Agreed? And come from a very practical kind of a point of view. He said, I can give you 250,000 acres of new land for the people and all that sort of thing. And he worked real hard. For like 2 years, he went back and forth to this capital, to Cairo, to Damascus, to Tel Aviv, to over and over and over again, putting together the deal. And he kind of did. He did and he didn't. They worked out a whole system. There was a lot of fighting and a lot of negotiating. Israel said this, and they said that. But by consistent effort and clear-headed negotiations, they narrowed the differences down, as the expression goes, and they figured out how much percentage of the water Israel has the right to claim, how much percentage of the water Jordan has the right to claim, how much does Syria have a right to claim, and so forth. And they worked it out because everybody's lusting for the water. You see? And they came together with a deal. It kind of works. Look here. This is Israel's water carrier. I don't know if you know this. When you go to Israel today, they're getting the water from up here, and it's brought down thus. That's how Israel gets the water it needs to live. Ad hayom hazeh. The Arabs, the Jordanians, did the same thing. Here's Jordan. See the pipeline? Right. This is Jordan River. This is Jordan itself. And right down here, this map shows you the pipeline that goes all the way through Jordan. They need that to live on their side. You see? This is where he's coming from. Now, this is not a little detail. It may strike you as a little detail, but it isn't. This plan was accepted by the technical committees. Notice the civil engineer guys from both Israel and the Arab League. A discussion in the Knesset in July of 1955 ended without a vote because Israel didn't feel comfortable being mavater, giving up on the water. But the Arab Expert Committee approved the plan in September of 55 and referred it to the Arab League Council. On 11 October of 1955, the Council voted not to ratify the plan due to the League's opposition to formal recognition of Israel. However, the Arab League committed itself to adhere to the technical details without providing official approval. Do you get what I'm saying? In other words, they say like this: the plan makes sense from the engineer point of view. We're not going to recognize Israel. We're not going to stop the war with Israel, but we'll do it. Which is what Eisenhower said. After the Suez Crisis in 56, the Arab attitudes hardened considerably, and the Arab League, with the exception of Jordan, who's the one who needs the water, now actively opposed the Johnston Plan, arguing that any plan to strengthen the Israeli economy only increased the potential threat from Israel. Regardless, both Jordan and Israel, who are the two countries who need the water, undertook to operate within their allocations, and two major successful projects were completed. The National Water Carrier of Israel, which is what you see in the map behind me on the left, and Jordan's East Gore Main Canal, which is today called the King Abdullah Canal. But I mean, that's what they use to get their water from the river, from the Kinneret. Both projects were partially funded by the U.S. after Israel and Jordan provided assurances that they would abide by their allocations. In 1965, even Nasser assured the American Undersecretary of State that the Arabs would not exceed the water quotas prescribed by the Johnson Plan. At this point, the other Arab states, meaning not Nasser, resolved to reduce the operation of Israel's national water carrier. They wanted to stop this, what you see in the map there, by diverting the headwaters of the Jordan. In other words, by stopping the water from going in from here, stopping the water from going here into Jordan. In other words, the river into the Kinneret. These are little rivers like the Yarmuk and others that lead into the Kinneret. And you understand, that means that they're going to divert the waters. That, my friends, is what led to the 6-Day War. Nobody gets it. It's all water. You see? Because when they started doing that, Israel said, oh yeah, we'll bomb you. And when you bomb you, and they started bombing them. And then Syria sent planes in there, and Israel shot them down. And then Rabin said, we'll do this, and they said this. And next thing you know, here we are. You see? So what seems like a little detail that Rabbi Katz is spending time is not a little detail at all. And I guarantee you, if we ever get final peace in the Middle East, this is going to be one of the major things you're going to be reading about in the paper the arguments and the stumbling blocks back and forth with Israel, the Palestinians, and the others. Because water. What are you going to do if you don't have any water? A number of years ago, Shimon Peres had the idea, which looked stupid in retrospect, about 10 years ago, oh, we don't need the Jordan River. We can import all the water from our best friend in the Middle East, Turkey. I rest my case. All right. So this is very typical of how Eisenhower operated, which is try to do by indirection, by plan, find a way that people can agree on. But as we all know, it didn't bring peace to the Middle East. But it is indicative of what I would call Eisenhower's acute intelligence. He was a very smart guy, and you'll see in a second, he liked to be devious in foreign policy. I would say in a good way. In other words, in this case, not in a bad way. Take a look at the next piece.
Eisenhower wanted to avoid war, contain communism, and protect the American economy. He often worked with a style that Vice President Richard Nixon called devious in the best sense of the word. Eisenhower maintained support with the great beam and smile he had acquired in World War II. But simultaneously, he was a political sophisticate who operated behind the scenes, pulling strings, and I came to call his presidency the hidden hand presidency.
So that's what I've been arguing over here. Now, the State Department was still the State Department. Henry Byrode, who was the Assistant Secretary for the Middle East, did not like Israel. But he was stupid about the way he went about knocking. He wasn't as smart as Eisenhower. And so he became best friends with Elmer Berger, the head of the American Council for Judaism, the anti-Israel groups. So here you have the Assistant Secretary for Middle Eastern Affairs being the keynote speaker at the National Conference of the American Council for Judaism, in which he said, Israel's no good, the Arabs should finally recognize Israel and put that behind them. Israel should stop bringing in more Jews to the Middle East and making the situation worse and attacking the Arabs and all this sort of thing. And he wasn't too clever. Within 6 months, he was out. But they sent him as ambassador to Egypt, which should have worked out. Dulles, and Nasser, let's put it this way. They wanted to get along. It didn't happen, Baruch Hashem. Okay? Because Nasser was originally seen as someone who was not communist, which was true, and was a nationalist, which was true, and he shouldn't be in favor of Russia particularly. That's how Dulles saw it. And as Dulles sees it, we don't want to lose the Middle East, as the expression goes over here. And the problem is, Nasser keeps saying our problem is not Russia, it's Israel. And so in 1953, 54, in early 55, in the early years of the Eisenhower administration, Dulles tried to broker a peace secretly by cession of the Negev to Egypt, or some piece of it. There were all kind of discussions back and forth. Maybe Egypt will run the kind of things you read about now with the PLO. Maybe Egypt will have a road that goes over the Negev that'll be Egyptian territory, or maybe Israel will just give up the Eilat, or this and that and the other, that'll give them a fig leaf for them to say we got a concession of Israel, and now we can make a peace. It's not a totally dumb idea, but Ben-Gurion was the prime minister. That's the wrong time to do that. Ben-Gurion said, no way. And fortunately for Israel, though, as I said, Dulles and Nasser view the world through very different lenses. For Dulles, it's all about containment. Dulles, although he always dissing Acheson, viewed himself as the successor of Acheson, which is to contain the Russians, keep them out, keep them stuck in Russia. At this time, America had a policy. Let's take the next picture. There's the map. Look at this. Here's America, of course. Here's NATO. Here's the map I'm showing you. NATO, all the countries that keeps Russia out. Then you have CETO, that Dulles put together, which is all the pro-Western countries keep China out. You see? Problem is in the middle is a gap. So Dulles would like to make Turkey, Iran, Pakistan. He did do one like that. Okay? And then he said, yes, and let's add the Arab states to that. And if the whole Middle East is united in one big NATO type thing, which they call METO or Baghdad Pact or something like that, then we'll keep the Russians out of the Middle East and we'll keep them contained and let them choke on their own communism. That was basically what Dulles saw as priority number one. He got the prime minister of Iraq, which was pro-American at that time, Nouri Pasha. Let's take the next picture. Who was very pro-American and a right-winger. And Nouri Pasha said, we'll have the Baghdad Pact. We'll sign it here in Baghdad. And all the countries in the Middle East should join this like pro-American NATO type situation for the Middle East. And it'll be great. For Nasser, on the other hand, Russia was not a threat. Russia had never invaded the Middle East. Now, Dulles said, but they could, but they never have. Communism will never take over the Arab world. And we kind of see what he means. Can you imagine the Russians would take over Saudi Arabia? I mean, they would choke on it. The head of the communists in Egypt and the Middle East was a Jew, Henri Curiel. A Jewish communist is not taking over Arabia. I mean, he said, now Dulles said, you never know, He said, but you see, they're talking past each other, okay? According to Nasser, the threat is not from Russia, it's not from Stalin and from Khrushchev. The threat is from these guys, from Ben-Gurion and Dayan, the Israeli militarists, as he saw it. The threat is also from the British and the French, who are the colonialists, like Anthony Eden, who've been ruling the Middle East since they took it over 80 years ago. Dulles didn't go for that at all. His slogan was, as you see over here in the next slide, Halonu ato l'Israel, you're for us or against us, right? In other words, make up your mind. He hated so-called neutralism. Those who are not for us are really going to be like Fidel Castro. Tomorrow, I'm sure, he said, Nasser will turn out to be a secret communist. We knew it all the time. Nasser, for his own reason, because he doesn't like the Dulles policy, uses his radio charisma to undermine the Baghdad Pact. You understand? He says it's a tool of the imperialists, which is, of course, what Russia wanted, but Nasser is doing for his own reasons. Take a look at this for a second, how the American press sees this.
Secretary of State Dulles arrives in Ankara for the meeting of the Baghdad Alliance and finds the Turkish capital a troubled city. 2 bombs set off just a few hours before his arrival blasted American property, the American Publications Bureau, and the warehouse wall inside the embassy compound. Foreign agents are blamed, for Turkey is staunchly pro-Western, but the incident sounded a grim note for the opening of a council meeting designed to steady this somewhat shaky alliance. Problems facing the council include the desire of its members that America formally join and supply greater aid. Neither desire was satisfied, but progress was made. America pledged $10 billion for a new communications network, and the first steps were taken for a unified command of all Baghdad-backed forces.
Now, who do you think Dulles blamed who set the bombs in the American installation in Israel? Nasser. You see? So this was great. Now, meanwhile, Ben-Gurion kept saying this, we'll join the Baghdad Pact. Can we get in? And Eisenhower kept saying, shut up. Right? You're the kiss of death. As soon as Israel joins some, all the Arabs will leave. Ben-Gurion said, but we want to join. You see? Because he wants to get into it. Eisenhower, analyzing the situation, seeks, therefore, to end the Arab-Israeli conflict in order to help the Cold War, the Baghdad Pact. You get it? He said, the Arabs fundamentally agree with us, except for this Israel business. We can't destroy Israel, so let's see if we can figure some way out to broker some kind of deal. Obviously, if we go on the press openly in public, it'll be impossible. Can we do it still or hate? Can we do it secretly, as I said before? And so he sends his most trusted subordinate, the person who he really wanted to be vice president, not Nixon, which is Robert Anderson of Texas, who later was the Treasury Secretary, was a hush of a guy. And again, nobody heard of him. That's Eisenhower's way. And he goes and shuttles back and forth and back secretly, like Kissinger did later on, between Nasser and Ben-Gurion and Nasser, all in 1955, 56 especially. And, they said, let's cut the bull. What's the bottom line? And the bottom line, Nasser says, I can't do it because if I do, I'll get killed by my own people. You understand? I can't do it. So whether that was true or whether it was not true, the bottom line is it's not going to happen to be an Arab-Israeli peace. So Eisenhower's a realist. He said, well, it's not going to work. It's not going to work. In other words, you don't go by what they say in public. You say what you say in private. Ben-Gurion is famous. He says, I'll tell Nasser I'm willing to fly there tomorrow if he can guarantee my safety. Now, there's no point. We can't make a peace. We can't do it. So what really is happening is like this. Nasser and Eisenhower and the others say like this, okay, if you can't have a peace, just tamp it down. Okay? Don't talk about it. Don't talk about it. Don't shoot at each other. Don't shoot each other. So it won't be a peace. But realistically, it'll be a peace. That's the best you can do in a situation. What can else do? That's the best you can do in the situation. He's talking to the wrong guys. You understand? Look, this is the essential problem of Middle East keeping down till today. The Arab leaders, even if they want to, the public doesn't want to have a peace to recognize Israel. That's why this guy, the head of the Palestinian Authority now, is really full of baloney, because whatever he wants to say for the media, the average Palestinians, they don't want a final peace with Israel. It sticks too much in their craw. So how do you do it? Eisenhower and Dulles say, is there some way we can win over Nasser? Of course, that scares Ben Gurion to death. Fortunately for Israel, Nasser didn't get it. And so he does his own thing, which is radicalizing the masses with the radio. He made these speeches to heat up everybody all across the Middle East and plotting to overthrow Arab regimes. Like King Hussein, I told you, they tried to kill him every 15 minutes. And the king of Saudi Arabia, and the king of Iraq, and the president of Syria, and the heads of Lebanon. And so Nasser didn't chop, or maybe didn't care, or didn't get it, that this is making him a poison in Washington, which was heaven sent for Ben Gurion, because Ben Gurion didn't leave a good Rosham in Washington either, you understand? But the only thing is, he's not, so against them. Nasser also spends this time supporting the Algerians and Moroccans in their violent uprising against the French, because they're trying to throw him out there. And every time you see a terrorist campaign, it was very ugly. We all know, unfortunately, we are familiar with the Israel situation, these Arab terrorists, the most violent, things go on there all the time. Nothing new. Went on back in the 50s, as you'll see in a second over there. And keep in mind, the person supplying the training and the weapons and the money for all these terrorists is Nasser. You see? Take a look at this. Yeah, this is what Arafat was dreaming about, This is who they are. So, by the way, does this make Nasser popular in France? No. This is going to be a big reason why, we'll see in the future, during these years, France and Israel get together, even though it's the most unusual alliance. So, politics does strange things. This made Nasser more unpopular with Dulles, who viewed Nasser as America's number one problem in the Middle East. If only Nasser didn't exist, everything would be great. We'd have guys like him and guys like him ruling all the Arab countries. There wouldn't be any problem. One of the big nightmares for the State Department, for the United States, is Nasser. Oh, that's very good for Israel. You understand? So he dug his own thing, as it were. The U.S. government, as usual, is conflicted. Depends which department of the government you're talking about. In the State Department, some favored appeasement in the best sense of the word, meaning let's kiss up to Nasser because he really represents the aspiration of the Arabs. And if we somehow or other can make a deal with him, that'll be the best thing for American policy. That was people like Henry Byrod, as I said before. On the other hand, there are others in the State Department that said Nasser is a secret communist. I can tell you like that. That was General Smith, who was the number 2 in the State Department, and he was Israel's friend. I told you before, I'm still not clear about it myself. According to some sources, his mother was Jewish. According to others, he wasn't. But anyway, he was a very good friend of Israel back in the 50s. This was the golden age of the CIA. The Eisenhower years was the golden era of the CIA when John Foster Dulles' brother was the head of the CIA. So he had 2 brothers running the whole business, and the sister was like number 3 in the State Department. Between the 3 of them, they had the whole business covered over there. There's Alan Dulles. They're always thinking like this. Maybe Nasser can be overthrown, like we did with the Shah. Right? Remember him? 1953. Eisenhower made the coup that knocked out the other guys that put the Shah in. Eisenhower loved the CIA. Let me tell you why. He was a very practical guy, as I said before. Wars cost a lot of money. A coup d'etat is cheap. Right? Now, I know you're going to laugh at me, and I'm going to say something that sounds silly, but after I finish, you're going to agree it's not silly. We were out to get Saddam Hussein. We ended up spending $1.5 trillion with all the rest of it. Suppose they would take a tenth of that and say whoever kills Saddam Hussein and these guys gets $100 billion or whatever. It's a smarter. Do you get my point? That's how the Ottoman Empire worked. When you're getting down to cold-blooded dollars and cents. I mean, do we really have to launch a D-Day to go after Saddam Hussein? This is how Eisenhower thought. So in his time, the CIA overthrew all kind of governments and did all these coups. Because that way, America gets what it wants, and it's cheaper. You see? Alan Dulles, who ran the CIA, he was a big spy for America in World War II. And he said at that time, and he was not wrong, in 1942 already, in 43, I know enough Germans inside Germany that if you just give me the green light, they can knock out Hitler and they'll have Germany surrender and we'll save a lot of things with the war. But Roosevelt said, no, we want unconditional surrender because last time in World War I, they didn't believe that they were defeated, and then another Hitler came along, I don't want that to happen again, and so on and so forth. But in reality, they could have ended World War II a year or two earlier with a lot fewer people killed, all the rest of it. So that's an interesting debate to have. Meanwhile, this guy's the head of the CIA in the 1950s. Ben-Gurion and Isser Harel, who was the head of the Mossad, worked very hard in these years, in 50-56, to set up a close relationship with Allen Dulles. They want to be regarded as allies in the Cold War. And I can tell you, in the Eisenhower administration, Ben-Gurion lined Israel up with America against Russia. Whether this was smart or not, but that's what happened. The Mossad is almost like a certain department of the CIA. They were very successful. They were building on the relationship that Ben-Gurion and Harel had set up 2 years earlier with Walter Beetlesmith, who had been the CIA director under Truman. So you know how it works. You can talk about foreign policy, or you can talk about what's really going on, which is the intelligence community. And Israel and the CIA is getting very, very close with each other during these years. The Mossad helps the CIA through its Jewish network. Because if there's one thing the Mossad has, especially in Eastern Europe, is all these Jews. They're communists. They're communists, but they're echadayid. You understand? And there were a lot of people like this. The most famous example of this took place in these years, in 1956, when Israel successfully stole Khrushchev's secret speech that he gave to the Communist Party Congress, which was supposed to be top secret, denouncing Stalin. I'll show you this. Israel got a hold of this through a Polish Jewish communist, okay, who knew a secretary in the office, and she gave it to Israel embassy or Mossad guy over there, and the Mossad guy, as soon as they saw it in Israel, they flew it. Israel flew to Washington, D.C., so I want to see Allen Dulles. Now, they said, here it is. And Eisenhower said, I guess, put on the front page of the New York Times, which they did, which is a big blow to communism. Take a look at this.
Israel's uniquely efficient citizen army was backed by an effective intelligence network. All over the world, people were available to provide information or spy on suspected enemies. In 1956, this network provided the Mossad with a copy of the secret speech
That's Khrushchev.
Stalin made by Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev at the 20th Communist Party Congress. The Mossad passed its copy of the speech to the CIA, which was impressed by the new agency's ability.
Okay, it's one of the famous intelligence coups, if you're into that sort of thing. And as a result, Israel built up a nice, cozy situation with the CIA. And one of the top guys over there, Angleton, James Jesus Angleton, was Israel's patron, their protector for the next 20 years, until he was kicked out, for the next 20 years for Israel. In other words, like when you have this Sinai campaign, and when you have the Six-Day War, all the rest of it, the main action is not happening like the people think at the State Department. The main action is happening at the CIA, where they're really talking to each other very frankly. James Angleton was one of the founders of the CIA. As you can tell by his name, he was not Jewish. He says, all right. Maybe you can tell his mother was Mexican. Can you tell that? No, really. But the middle name. But Angleton was the head of the counterintelligence, all the rest of it, but totally outside of the organization box. This is a violation of organization procedure. It's supposed to be intelligence, counterintelligence, space logistics, and this and that, the other. Angleton, besides all of his other things, had the Israel desk, which means he has a special connection with the Mossad, and they can do all kind of crazy things that the CIA can't get from anybody else. And the CIA, therefore, is the bright spot for Israel in the Eisenhower administration, even though Allen Dulles is by no means a Jew lover. The dirty truth is, though, that the main asset of the CIA were the foreign intelligence agencies who supplied them with information. We know the CIA has a lot of times been a bunch of boobs. But on the other hand, they're connected with the British, the French, the Australians, and so on and so forth around the world, and the Israelis. The Israelis not the least of them. And so they get a ton of information from everybody else that puts you on par. Under Eisenhower, the State Department and the Pentagon keep Israel at arm's length. Ben-Gurion is a total turnoff. Sharet is not. Okay, so Eisenhower, the few times he meets Ben-Gurion, said, get this guy out of here, because they did not talk to soon as he would get together with Eisenhower, he said, let me tell you the history of the Jewish people and why we're in favor of Israel. They start with the Bible. He said, I don't want to hear this again, And but that's what it was. The U.S. views the retaliation raids that we talked about, that the way current U.S. administration views the buildings on the West Bank, as they call it, right? Which is not helpful for peace. And Ben-Gurion is Mr. Retaliation Raid. That's who he was. I mean, Moshe Dayan was leading all the attacks on the Arabs with Ben-Gurion's blessing. So there's a fundamental difference in approach between Eisenhower on the one hand and Ben-Gurion on the other. On a personal level, he didn't like him, as I told you before. Here, look at the next picture. Eisenhower was smiling. He did not even smiling. He looks like he has a bad stomach. It is what it is. The main difference boils down to this. Ben-Gurion has two objectives. And he was a monomaniac, which was a strength and a plus and a minus, which Ben-Gurion pursued relentlessly. He wanted to get weapons from America, and he wanted to get a defense treaty. His reason is that Israel is under existential threat. The Arabs, as they want to push us into the sea, we need American top weapons, and we need a formal defense treaty. There's NATO, there's CETO. America has defense treaties with this country and this country. Why not Israel? You see? By contrast, Eisenhower keeps saying all these years, you're not in danger. Actually, you're stronger than all the Arabs. I know what I'm talking about. I was a general, not like you, I know the numbers. I know the equipment. I see the intelligence reports. What are you talking about? You see? Without saying it, Ike implies, to use a notorious current expression, I got your back. All right? Trouble is, if he ever actually would say that, Ben-Gurion was the type of person who would immediately announce it in the press, and the U.S. would, and then say the U.S. formally committed to Israel's defense, etc., which is precisely what Eisenhower, the lover of subtlety, does not want to do. And so basically, Eisenhower was implying he was watching out from Israel, but from behind. There was no need to get out in public, so why would you do that? I told you that's who he was. Just do it and shut up. Don't talk about it. Moreover, Eisenhower argued, it's in Israel's interest to keep the level of violence, and especially the level of armaments, as low and as primitive as possible, which was not really wrong. You understand? Why do you want American weapons? Then the Arabs will get the Russian weapons. Then you'll get this weapons. They get it. So what's the point? Meanwhile, as it stands right now, they have lousy tanks. You have a little bit better than lousy tanks. Keep it that way. It's in your interest to keep it that way. Right now, they don't have recoilless rifles or something like that. Why do you want to make it that a situation will get heated up and they're going to want that? I don't understand where it's going. Right now, there is an Israel. You understand? What do you have to keep the situation by making retaliation? So they kill a few people, and they kill a few people. No, a few people there. It doesn't affect Israel altogether. Every day you're taking in tens of thousands of immigrants. Why do you just accept this as the price of doing business? You see? And Ben-Gurion couldn't hear that. Ben-Gurion and Israel were traumatized from the Shoah. They viewed the Arabs as an existential threat that required constant raids, and Israel is in need of as much modern armaments as she could get and stop being philosophical. This is the golden age of Shimon Peres when he's running all over the world trying to steal or get weapons one way or the other, and more it says, when you get jets, the Russians will get jets. The Egyptians will get jets. But meanwhile, we got the jets. So Eisenhower, who was a smart guy, couldn't understand that. And he wasn't exactly wrong either. You understand? But as always, it's a culture clash. Culture is everything, and we have to understand what Israel was in the 1950s. To Ben-Gurion and Israel, Nasser was another Hitler. That's the language they use all the time. To Eisenhower, that's ridiculous. I fought Hitler. Hitler had the German army. Nasser doesn't have the German army. Nasser's a little pipsqueak, he's a problem. How can you compare it to Hitler? He can't drive the Jews into the sea. Ben-Gurion says, oh, yes, he can. And so the U.S. and Israel talked past each other, and bad chemistry prevented a personal airing of the issues and a clearing of the air. They couldn't have a frank and long set of conversations the way I said it. This was bad enough until 55, 53, 54, and into 1955. But when Nasser, as we'll see in the future, started getting real weapons from the Russians, from the Soviets, the disconnect between Eisenhower and Ben-Gurion became enormous. To Eisenhower, Israel is still in no big danger. There weren't that many Russian weapons, and it's a huge challenge to launch a war against Israel, especially in the absence of Soviet advisors and technicians. I was a general, right? Even if the Russians give you 50, what am I talking about? Planes, jet fighters. And if they give you, the MiGs. And if I give you the T-34 planes. I get it. Listen, I looked at the numbers. I see everything. They can't, it's not so easy to launch a war against Israel. They can't do it. Take it from me. Ben-Gurion says, a guy. You understand? The first part, stay here, And Eisenhower said, but I commanded the D-Day. You don't know anything. And so it went back and forth. So Ben-Gurion is going to start the idea. He says, Eisenhower is no different than Neville Chamberlain, right? Chamberlain, gave in to Hitler. Eisenhower said, how can you compare me to Neville Chamberlain? This is not Munich. You understand? Take it easy. You know what you're talking about. But it didn't work. It's a failure of communications. The atmosphere of mutual distrust would explode, we'll see, in 1956 in the Sinai campaign, in which it put America, this was exactly the reason it happened, because of the total miscommunication between the two sides. They saw things very differently, okay? And when, without reshus from America, Israel went and conquered the Sinai desert, as we all know, even before I tell you, America made them give it back. You see? And anyway, Eisenhower said, I guess, you dummy, what'd you gain by this? You didn't get rid of Nasser. It would lead, in 1956 and 57, to the single greatest crisis in relations between Israel and the U.S. in history, when Eisenhower and Ben-Gurion were clashing over the Sinai. When Israel wouldn't leave, but Eisenhower basically said, we'll cut the money off. You understand? We don't even have to cut the money off, as you'll see. We just cut off the UGA tax deduction. No, but it sounds funny, but you understand it's not funny. Okay, that's all you need to do. And so Israel had to give in. So what was it that caused this? It's not that Eisenhower was anti-Israel, as you see over here. He wasn't pro-Israel. It's not that he thought that, let him go down the drain or something like that. The Americans and the Israelis viewed the objective situation in the Middle East from completely different points of view. And for one reason or another, they're not able to get together and agree on a consensus on how to view the situation. That, however, is for the future. Good night.